2008 financial crisis didn't just send global markets plunging. It also destroyed a great deal of public trust in banks and financial institutions as responsible stewards of the economic social order. Banks have paid over $365 billion in fines in the last few years. In fact, in the last 12 months alone, more than $30 billion was paid by fines by Wells Fargo, HSBC, RBS. It is not only the fines that companies have to pay, but the cost of improving their image and getting it right. As highlighted at the recent forum in Paris, some companies have paid over $900 million in the last few years to get it right. The fact is that the world has changed, and reputation is important, so much so that the millennials are now interested to work for companies they trust. The fact is, though, that 44% of people do not trust businesses, and a lot more do not trust the banks. As Warren Buffett said, trust is like the air we breathe. When it's present, nobody really notices. When it's absent, everybody notices. Thus, organizing this colloquium at a university with young people who are the future of the business world to address whether we can bank on banking conditions is very timely. When I was growing up, my father said to me, you are allowed to make mistakes in your life, but learn from those mistakes. In fact, someone recently said to me, mistakes are simply mistakes. Have we learned, though, in Cyprus from the banking inquiries? We have had a number of banking inquiries in the last 5 years. We've had 2 banking institutions shut their doors. Many people lost their savings, their jobs, and above all, a lot of people lost their trust in banks. Without further ado, I call upon Dr. Yazidou to give the welcoming address on behalf of the head of the department, Dr. Zokiadis, who is currently overseas. Thank you, Dr. Yazidou.
Excellency, distinguished guests, dear colleagues, dear students, ladies and gentlemen, it is with great pleasure and honor to welcome you to this colloquium entitled From Investigation to Action. Can we bank on the Banking Commission? First, I would like to thank the keynote speakers for accepting the invitation to contribute to the event. The aim of the Department of Hotel and Tourism Management is to organize events that can positively impact the economy and social life. After all, the companies in the hotel and tourism industries are clients of the bank, so they have a vested interest to ensure the banking integrity is maintained. Over the last few years, the world, and Cyprus in particular, experienced a severe financial crisis that resulted in the introduction of austerity measures and other bailout initiatives that alter the economic, social, and public health policy landscape of Western-centric socio-political systems. In the case of Cyprus, the financial crisis captured international attention and brought to bear significant changes on people's lives, employment, and career progression opportunities. More specifically, on the 25th of March 2013, the Republic of Cyprus became a recipient of 10 billion international bailout by the Eurogroup, European Commission, European Central Bank, the International Monetary Fund. In return, Cyprus agreed to close the country's second largest bank, the Cyprus Popular Bank, also known as Laiki Bank, and to impose a haircut on deposits over 100,000 euros. The aftermath of this sanction was a way for Cyprus to reconsider and revamp its financial policy and to find ways for quick recovery. The first step was to seriously consider the factors that led to the financial crisis. At the present, the situation is, according to the governmental rhetoric, steadily heading to full recovery. What happened in Cyprus is analogous to what is happening in other countries, with the main problem being that the banking sector suffers from a myriad of problems, which are related to the lack of effective policies, government and political conflicts, vested interests, bigotry, and nepotism. Today's colloquium aims to provide an insight into the Commission's approach to the improvement of the banking sector by considering the cases of Australia and Cyprus, while enhancing understanding on their government reactions and actions taken in order to avoid any future condition, political exigencies and circumstances that might lead to a new financial crisis. The keynote speakers are the High Commissioner of Australia, who will shed light on the case of Australia, and Commissioner Hayes' report on the banking and insurance sector in February 2019, and Professor Stavros Zenios from the University of Cyprus, who will analyze the case of Cyprus and discuss the numerous reports on the banking sector in the last few years. Finally, I would like to reiterate my thanks to the keynote speakers. I'm sure that their presentation will lead to constructive debate and discussion, but most importantly, they will provide an informed understanding of the actions that can be taken to facilitate effective policy making and implementation of best practices that can lead to viable and socially justice economic policies in both countries. The presentation will also shed light on the actions taken or not taken thus far and have an impact in resurrecting the discussion of what needs to be done to ensure the sustainability of the banking sector, especially in our country. Additionally, the presentations by High Commissioner Beaver and Professor Zenios will provide novel and creative insights into the formulation and implementation of effective economic models and strategies to mitigate the adversities and threats of uninformed fiscal policy initiatives. Last but not least, I would like to thank Associate Professor Maria Novardis for organizing this insightful and timely colloquium, and also the students who volunteered to help, especially Yannis Theophanos. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Yassiri. In recent years, we've seen Australian alumni under the chairmanship of Mr. Psychos Philogiannis diverse and not only organize social events like the customary Surla at Platania and Walkabout, but also get involved in supporting professional events such as the recently organized book launch for a fellow Cypriot living in the diaspora and this particular event. Thus, I call Mr. Philogiannis for his welcome address.
Dr. Yassiri, Dr. Maria Novardis, Australian High Commissioner for Cyprus, Mr. Sam Beaver, ladies and gentlemen, students. The Australian Alumni Association is very pleased to support this colloquium being organised by the Department of Hotel and Tourism Management of CUT, and in particular our Vice Chairperson and fellow alumni, Ms. Maria Novardis, for organising this event. Several weeks ago, we were here in this place launching a book called Tales of Cyprus, once again thanks to the collaboration and hospitality of CUT. And I said that whatever activity we do as Australian Alumni Association in Cyprus is inevitably of benefit to both Cyprus and Australia. This event is a fine example of that, as it focuses in the recent banking commissions in Cyprus and Australia, and how each government decided and chose to act upon their findings and recommendations. For those who may not know what the Australian Alumni Association of Cyprus is about, let me tell you a couple of things. One is to bring together, connect, support graduates from Australian universities living in Cyprus, to establish and foster closer academic, social and cultural relationships between Australia and Cyprus, and to organise various activities, academic, cultural, business and social activities. With regards to the topic of the colloquium, I think that behind all this, the essence of corruption, while corruption is considered inevitable in any society, a lot of actions can be taken in order to reduce it. In my view, the way Australia has managed to combat and limit corruption has been through the strengths of democratic systems, the high cultural and educational level of its citizens, the structures of an effective civil society, of course, a strong, independent judicial system, and a decent, transparent public service. I wish the organisers and everyone here every success. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Filoyannis. In 2019, 2 banking commissions were reported in both countries have called home, that is Australia and Cyprus. What struck me most was when the report was published by Commissioner Hayne in Australia, was that he placed the report on the desk and he did not hand it to the Treasurer. In fact, he refused to shake his hand. That said a lot and made news around the world. Can we bank on banking commissions? Let's see what our distinguished guests have to say. I call upon Honourable High Commissioner Mr. Viva for his talk and post-mortem of the High Commission. Thank you.
Well, that's right, I'll get started. Dr. Liasiou, my co-presenter, Professor Zenios, our moderator for today, Associate Professor Kapadis, students, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for being here tonight at this evening's colloquium, and particularly for your interest in Australia's recent experience in strengthening our banking system. At the outset, I'd like to thank the Cyprus University of Technology for hosting us, and also for giving me this opportunity to speak with you. It's both a privilege as well as a challenge to speak on such a technical topic, especially for someone with no apparent training in the field. So as a history and a Japanese language major at university, I think I'd probably feel more comfortable talking to some students in Tokyo about the Boer War, rather than telling you all about the darkest corners of the financial sector. But nonetheless, as they say in Australia, I'll give it a red hot go anyway, so bear with me. But before I do, I'd like to particularly acknowledge and thank Maria for her initiative in proposing and putting together tonight's colloquium. I'd also like to thank the Australian Alumni Association, the Institute of CPAs, the Cyprus Institute for Financial Services, and the Banking Association as well for their support. So in the time that's allotted to me, I'd just like to briefly step through 6 key focus areas, which you'll see on the screen shortly. First of all, to provide some context, I'll share with you just some very general background on the Australian economy, and particularly the role that the banking and finance sector plays within it. From there, we'll look briefly at what exactly happened, both in the sector as well as in the broader Australian society, that necessitated a Royal Commission. So we'll look at what the case was for reform. In considering the response to that case, it's important not only to consider and to look at the findings of the Royal Commission, but also the nature of the Royal Commission process itself, because it's a very particular mechanism in Australia's democracy, and one which has only been used 12 times in the past quarter of a century. And finally, we'll look at how the government responded and what work is still ahead of us. So if I start with just a brief sketch of the Australian economy, though known as a major agricultural, mining and energy producer, Australia's economy is actually one of the world's most open and varied. Underpinning Australia's strong economy is its open and transparent trade and investment environment, a business-friendly regulatory approach, and trade and economic links with emerging economies, and those economies particularly in our own region of the Indo-Pacific. Australia's economy is considered one of the strongest, most stable and diverse in the world, and we're currently experiencing the 28th consecutive year of uninterrupted economic growth, a record unequalled by any other developed nation over the period. From 1991 to 2008, Australia's economy grew by an average 3.2% in real terms every year. Australia's growth is not only, or has not only been strong, it's also been broad-based, with 12 out of the 19 major sectors in the economy growing above 3% per annum. And despite perceptions to the contrary, there's much more to Australia's economy than just mining and resources. Indeed, almost 3/4 of economic output in Australia is generated by the services sector. And so of particular relevance to tonight's topic, in terms of share of GDP, Australia's financial services sector is the largest in our economy at roughly 10%. But not everything is smooth sailing, as the openness of our economy and its dependence on trade means that global headwinds can hit us pretty hard. Indeed, earlier this week, the IMF cut its growth forecasts for the Australian economy in 2019 from 2.1% to 1.7% against global growth of 3%. Now, this is the slowest pace of growth that we've seen since the global financial crisis. And of course, the reasons are obvious based on rising trade barriers and higher uncertainty from geopolitical crises. But the story of Australia's economy is essentially one of reform. Australia has a long history of undertaking economic reforms aimed at both creating a more flexible as well as a more resilient economy. If you're in Australia in the 1970s, the economy that you would see is very different today. It would be one where typified by a manufacturing sector focused on the domestic market, low rates of innovation and skills development, and high-cost infrastructure services like power, communications and transport. So in response, policymakers took steps to liberalise the economy, and the reforms that were undertaken were certainly not easy. Removing tariffs, floating the dollar, deregulation and labour law reforms led to protests, job losses and a very deep sense of trepidation among the Australian public. So while difficult though, these reforms turned the economy around. They reversed our sliding GDP, increased productivity and grew trade. And trade is a central part of our story. One underpinning Australia's success has been our openness to trade, foreign investment, ideas and technology, capital and skilled migration. 1 in 5 Australian workers today, or roughly 2.2 million people, are employed in some form of trade-related activity. Recent research found that exporters employ more people than non-exporters, and full-time workers who are working in export-related businesses are more productive and receive higher wages. Foreign investment has also played a key role. Australian businesses with foreign direct investors support 1 in 10 jobs in Australia. Another thing that we've done over the past 15, 20 years is to strike a range of free trade agreements. We have agreements in force with 11 countries at the moment. 4 more have been negotiated but are yet to enter into force. And we're currently negotiating another 7, including a major deal with the European Union. The 5th round of negotiations just concluded yesterday in Canberra. And many don't appreciate the economic links between Australia and the EU. We're not just all about North and Southeast Asia. The EU as a bloc is our 3rd largest two-way trading partner, and it will stay that way whether the EU comprises 28 or 27 members. So it's no surprise then that Australia is a champion as well as a beneficiary of the global rules-based economic order. As an island nation, our prosperity depends on trade. So we raise our voice to resist protectionism and to advocate and promote open markets wherever we can. But to the essential... Oh, we're on? I'll keep going. So to the essentials of this evening's topic, I wanted to just, having sketched out what the economy looks like, talk a little bit about how the financial services sector fits in. And beginning with authorised deposit-taking institutions, or ADIs. Collectively, ADIs hold over 50% of the total assets of Australia's financial institutions. So they make up the largest part of the Australian financial system. Now, an ADI is simply a financial institution that's regulated by the Australian Prudential Regulation Authority, or APRA, and it's enabled to accept deposits from the public. APRA, the Australian Prudential Regulation Authority, is the statutory regulator of institutions in the banking, superannuation and insurance sector. And its legislative role is to protect the interests of depositors, of policyholders and superannuation fund members. Now, to give a sense of scale of these ADIs, ADIs hold $4.6 trillion worth of assets. So that's around 2.5 times the size of Australia's $1.9 trillion nominal economy. Within that, the major banks, and there are 4 main banks in Australia known as the Big Four, they hold approximately 3/4 of the total assets held by ADIs. Banks provide a wide range of services and products to Australian customers and consumers in business. And in particular, bank lending is a key source of external financing for SMEs and agriculture. So the reach of banks reach into everyone's lives, and they're deeply embedded in all parts of Australian society, both financially as well as culturally, if you like. Housing loans are a good example. Housing loans are the largest assets on the books of the ADIs, and they comprise 40% of their assets in 2017. Bank lending also represents the main form of external finance for agriculture, with 96% of rural debt held by banks. So what led us to the Royal Commission? So essentially, beginning from 2014, a series of major scandals involving the Big Four banks began to erode the trust of the public and eventually led to political pressure on the government to call the Royal Commission. In May of 2014, a major investigation by a National Current Affairs program exposed a sales-driven culture within the Commonwealth Bank of Australia, so one of the Big Four banks, in their financial planning division, a culture that was described as profit at all cost. This began a process to shine quite an unflattering light on some of the ways that the banks had achieved record-level profits at the same time as they were paying record-level remuneration to their executives. And again, for context, ADIs, those authorised deposit institutions, returned a net profit in the 12 months to September 2017 of $36 billion, with the major banks achieving by far the highest profit margins. So the CBA, the Commonwealth Bank of Australia, was subsequently involved in a range of different matters, including accusations of money laundering for drug syndicates, turning a blind eye to terrorism financing, ignoring statutory reporting requirements for more than 3 years and for over 750,000 accounts, and impropriety in forex trading. In 2015, another of the Big Four, this time the National Australia Bank, was forced to compensate its customers for what was considered inappropriate financial planning advice. A whistleblower from that organisation claimed there was a volatile, toxic and Machiavellian culture within the NAB. The NAB was also implicated in impropriety and forex trading too. The other 2 major banks in the Big Four, Westpac and ANZ, were implicated in allegations of rigging the bank bill swap rate, one of the main interest rates used in key interest rates in Australia. Westpac was sued for using an automated process to decide whether people's home loan applications met lending criteria. So if you really want to get to the heart of the desires and aspirations of the Australian public, start messing with their family home. One of its employees was jailed for fraudulently lending millions of dollars to vulnerable Australians and elderly pensioners. ASIC, the Australian Securities and Investment Commission, found that bank employees disclosed confidential details of their clients' orders to other forex traders, and Westpac failed to pass on benefits that 220,000 of its clients should have received under their products. Now, despite numerous public complaints and a Senate inquiry, very few senior bank staff were dismissed due to misconduct. But at the same time, some actions were being taken, both by government and the industry. So in a review in April 2016 into bankers' pay and bankers' commissions recommended a termination of linking bonus payments to sales performance for retail bank employees. So there were efforts to try and break the incentive structure for frontline frontline retail bank employees. In January 2017, members of the Australian Banking Association launched their banking initiative to provide improved products, service and culture and better information to consumers. And in September 2017, the government introduced legislation to establish the Australian Financial Complaints Authority, an external dispute resolution body. Throughout this period, though, there was also widespread criticism of ASIC, the Australian Securities Investment Corporation's activities as a regulatory body, and particularly its supervision of banks. So with public anger rising, bank profits soaring, and political pressure mounting, at the end of 2017, the government announced plans to establish the Royal Commission. So it was that in December 2017, Kenneth Hayne QC was appointed Royal Commissioner. Hayne was directed to inquire the critical attack. No, that's right, sorry. Commissioner Hayne was directed to inquire into and report on misconduct in the banking, superannuation and financial services industry. Now, at this point, a little bit of background on what a Royal Commission is useful here, because they're a reasonably, they're an extremely powerful tool and a very potentially politically dangerous tool that's at the disposal of the government. The powers of a Royal Commission in Australia are set out in enabling legislation, the Royal Commission Act from 1902, so they've been with us since our federation. Royal Commissions have the powers to issue summons to persons to appear before the Commission and to give evidence or to produce documents. They require witnesses to take an oath or to give an affirmation. Any person served with a summons or a notice to produce documents must comply with that requirement or face prosecution, and if convicted, up to 2 years imprisonment. Additionally, Royal Commissions may authorise the Australian Federal Police to execute search warrants. So Royal Commissions are incredibly powerful. And in this case, the Royal Commission into Financial Services held 7 rounds of public hearings over 68 days, that heard from 130 witnesses, and it received over 10,000 submissions from the public. So throughout that process, what did it find? Well, by and large, it confirmed a lot of the media reporting that had led up to it. Commissioner Hayne found that the primary responsibility for misconduct lay with the entities themselves and their boards and senior management, and that failings of culture, governance and remuneration required redress. The final report had 76 recommendations and 24 referrals for potentially criminal conduct, including in 3 of the 4 major banks. 54 recommendations were directed to government, 10 to the industry and 12 to regulators. Now, given the number and detail of the recommendations, thankfully I won't go through them all, but what I think is important is what Commissioner Hayne said himself. What guided him was 6 key norms of conduct up on the slide there. To obey the law, to not mislead or deceive, to act fairly, to provide services that are fit for purpose, to deliver services with reasonable care and skill, and finally, when acting for another, act in the best interests of that other. Now, that these guiding principles are really so self-evident gives you some indication of the need for action and reform in this area. So what did the government do? Well, it had an interim report 6 months ahead of the release date. It got an interim report was released mid-2018, must have been. But on 4th of February this year, the government released both the final report of the Royal Commission as well as its response to it. In doing so, the government committed to take action on all 76 recommendations, and in some areas to go further. So collectively, this response for Australia will be the largest and most comprehensive corporate and financial services law reform package since the early 1990s. And it will demand significant new legislation. And indeed, in 2019, it will make up 75% of the Treasury's legislative program, which in and of itself is 25% of the government's total legislative agenda. So a huge amount of work that our parliamentarians in this particular year will be devoted to responding to the Hayne Royal Commission. The government has already begun to implement 15 of the commitments it made in response to the Royal Commission, and significant progress has also been made on a further 5 recommendations, with draft legislation introduced, released for comment, or detailed consultation underway. A few months ago, on the 9th of August, the government released its implementation roadmap that will guide how it responds. Under that roadmap, close to 90% of its commitments will have been implemented by mid-next year. By the end of 2020, remaining recommendations that require legislative change will have been introduced. And finally, the government also announced an independent review of progress after 3 years to assess the extent of changes in industry practice and whether they are leading to improved customer outcomes. But as I alluded to before, reform is the economic engine that can't ever be allowed to stop. And since the release of the roadmap on 11th of September, the government began consultation on new draft legislation to further strengthen ASIC's enforcement and supervision functions. Since then, there have been calls for the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, the ACCC, which regulates anti-competitive behaviour, to open an inquiry into banking competition. Now, unsurprisingly, the big 4 banks and some of the smaller banks aren't overly convinced of the need of another inquiry. There's significant inquiry fatigue that's happening in the sector at the moment. However, it goes to show that there is a strong demand for continual reform. But what ultimately can be concluded from this entire process? Well, Australia's experience was that practices in the banking and financial services sector had become misaligned clearly with community expectations. After almost 30 years, major reform was necessary to restore public trust and to strengthen regulatory oversight. And to answer the initial question of the colloquium, can we bank on banking commissions? In our recent experience, I'd suggest that the answer is yes, we can. The primary conclusion that I would draw from this process is that the system actually worked. It responded to significant community concern, and in some cases, genuine harm, through an arm's length, apolitical inquiry, whose recommendations were and are being acted on in full to protect consumers without sacrificing the very significant contribution the sector makes to the Australian economy. But for those who are interested in learning more and reading through some of those 10,000 public submissions, all papers received, the final report as well as the government's response, can be found on the Treasury website at the top link. And for further information on the Twin Peaks of Australian financial services regulation, you can go to the APRA or the ASIC websites up there. So I've taken up just a little bit more time than I was meant to, but I'd be remiss in my duties if, as Australian High Commissioner, I didn't give a brief and very shameful plug for the benefits of Australian education. So, of course, you don't have to take my word for it. You can also talk to the members of the Australian Alumni Association who are here tonight, and they can also sing the praises, because there's a lot to recommend education in Australia, and I'd suggest there are many reasons to consider studying down under. Australia is the 3rd most popular destination for international students across the world, and we are currently home to over 700,000 international students. In Australia, of course, you'll be among friends. You'll be among the 2nd largest Cypriot community outside of Cyprus after the UK. in Australia, but first and foremost, you'll enjoy an enviable lifestyle. But first and foremost, you'll receive a world-class education in globally ranked institutions with a track record of research and innovation. Institutions that gave the world Wi-Fi, penicillin, in vitro fertilisation, the bionic ear, and the black box flight recorder. And though your mothers may disagree, Australia really isn't that far away. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Greenwald. I'll tell it 20 hours away.
That's all.
Yeah, that's all. Get the next presentation up. Professor Stavros Zenios is more than qualified to speak on the matter, as not only he's an academic teaching in the area at the University of Cyprus, but has served on the board of the Central Bank and was a member of one of the commission inquiries with Honorable Judge Begis. I call upon Professor Zenios.
Your Excellency, High Commissioner, dear colleague, Maria Kapagis, Sido, dear friends, it's always a pleasure to, in spite of the parking problem, it's always a pleasure to be here. And it's a pleasure to be at the back. Now, it's been said that there are all two wisdom. It's simple and plain to express. Err and err and err again, but less and less and less. Now, listening to the High Commissioner and to leading with my presentation, I don't have an addendum to this less and less and less. In very precise steps. We've heard a beautiful presentation of very precise steps that the country has taken to learn from its mistakes or to avoid making mistakes that they could have made. In my remarks tonight, I want to make 3 points. The first point is in a sense to make us all feel a little bit better, that banking crises are the norm more than the exception. My second point is why and how should an investigation be conducted once a crisis unfolds? And third, how did Cyprus investigate its banking crisis, and were we successful or not? Now, my punchline is going to come on the last slide. I have to warn the non-Greek speakers in the audience that my last slide, I have 4 slides. They are only English, but the last one is in Greek. But I can assure you, Mr. Commissioner, that I don't know how good you are Greek, but even if you understand not a single word of Greek, you are going to get my punchline. So in this suspense, let me start. For my first point that crises are prevalent, I will draw from academic literature. For the second, on how should an investigation be conducted, I will draw lessons from countries like Iceland, Ireland, and the United States, and for my next speech also from Australia, who have done a remarkable job in investigating a crisis, and importantly, they followed up their investigations with actions. For the third point, how did it do in Cyprus, I will base my remarks on 2 reports by Cyprus commissions. The LaSalle report of the Independent Commission on the Future of the Cyprus Banking Sector of 2013, LaSalle's report, and the report of the Commission for the Failure of the Cyprus Cooperative Bank of 2019. I will also comment on the Begis Commission that has been mentioned, on the investigation of the collapse of the Cyprus economy of 2013, because it's quite instructive. So banking crises are the norm more than the exception. There is a brilliant book by Professor Galoviris from Columbia University and Harper from Princeton, published 2014, with the title Fragile by Design. And the subtitle tells the story, the political origins of banking crisis and scarce credit. The authors are asking why are banking systems unstable in so many countries, but not in others. For instance, the United States had 12 banking crises since 1840, while Canada had none. The authors have a rather mechanical classification of what they call the happy six countries, countries without a crisis. These countries are Australia, Canada, Hong Kong, Malta, New Zealand, and Singapore. Now, I call that classification mechanical, as it is based on identifying countries that did not have a crisis from 1970 until they wrote their book, but there is nothing that guarantees that the countries will be happy forever. Nevertheless, their classification is very stark. They look at the political and banking history of the United Kingdom, the United States, Canada, Mexico, and Brazil through several centuries, and they show that chronic banking crises are not an accident. The book brings political history into the study of banking to examine how coalitions of politicians, bankers, and other interest groups form, and how they generate policies that determine who gets to be a banker, who has access to credit, and who pays for bank bailouts and rescues. The decisions made by the political system, or to be more precise, the decisions by the nexus of banks with the political system can create fragilities. Actually, the inherent fragility of the banking system arises from the unavoidable mismatch of short-term deposits and long-term loans is exacerbated by political decisions. In the words of a Financial Times reviewer, the book manages to explain the recent crisis, 2008, precisely because it is not free of politics. Hence the title emphasizes the political origins of bank crisis. Now, let me clarify something. We're not talking just about the issues, and I'm going to read from a very nice invitation that Maria sent us. It's not just about government and political interference, lack of independence of board members, nepotism, or political intervention. These are present, but we're also talking about policies that serve one or more groups, including the government coalition, in the short run, while building risks for the overall economy. For instance, the US subprime mortgage crisis of 2008 was fermented in the late 1990s. The mechanism was set up by a political coalition within quotes between activist groups for the poor and minorities, and their political representative, who was President Bill Clinton, with megabanks. In return for political support for mergers, banks committed vast amounts of credit to poor borrowers. Activists lobbied for weaker underwriting standards at the government sponsored mortgage insurers to encourage more lending. The result was the subprime mortgage bubble. Now, let me make a political disclaimer. What I just described by the United States left and in Europe, they consider the story of the Clinton coalition of mega banks and lobby groups for the poor as Republican disingenuity. Indeed, it was the affluent classes and not the poor and the minorities that speculated in subprime loans. It was the rating agencies who failed to properly account for the risks. It was the mortgage originators who benefited from the credit frenzy, and it was the bankers who reached the huge bonuses. But the political coalition that set the economy on a crashing course deserves to be appreciated. In Cyprus, a similar phenomenon took place since 2000, setting in motion the 2013 crash. For political reasons, this has been overlooked except by some academics and economic analysts. And let me show a chart. I have to do this. Okay, voila. The chart shows the Cyprus debt. There are 4 different shades. This is the total debt of the Cyprus economy, households, corporation, banks, and the top one, the black, is the government debt. It shows that the Cyprus debt more than doubled in the 10-year period before joining the euro. This increase of debt created immense fragilities. The Cyprus banking system had assets 10 times the GDP of the country. It could not be saved if a big crisis had arrived. Also, channeling the well-known Russian money to the local economy exacerbated the risk. The so-called loan-to-deposits ratio, loan to deposits, was a seemingly healthy one. You give as many loans as you have deposits, right? Good. But the loan to deposits for residential loans increased from a moderately risky yellow 1.4 in 2006 to a flashing red of 2.1 by 2013. And this explains the challenge we are facing today in reducing non-performing loans. The problem is not going away even if the economy is recovering. Now, note something extraordinary in this chart. As the country is building up excessive debt, the government debt is narrowing before 2008. This was in order to satisfy the Maastricht criteria to join the euro. How did the government do it? Of course, we have the fiscal discipline of the Papadopoulos presidency. But the fiscal discipline was made easier due to government revenues from the real estate. Here, you have the political coalition between the government, the real estate developers, and the banks. It explains the poor lending standards. It explains the poor lending standards, the lax supervision, and the lack of any political debate. The coalition center-left government benefited both in its policy objective of the center party to join the euro and the objective of the left to fuel social programs. And of course, the opposition conservative party was not the one to challenge what was beneficial for the banking sector and the real estate developers. So it's more than about corruption. There are deeper roots. Not that everything the commissioners say and everything Maria has on the invitation does not play an important role, but there is more to it. In some countries we have to uncover. And you have heard how in Australia they started looking into it, even if they're the happy seats. They never had a daily price, but they said there is something wrong here. Trust is a role. We have to act. So if it's not just about corruption and a couple of crooks, bank management crooks, how should an investigation be conducted once a crisis unfolds? I'm going to quote a speech from Mario Draghi from last week on the 3 qualities that often appear to inform good decision-making: knowledge, courage, and humility. Good investigations require knowledge, courage, and humility. In May 2012, I wrote 2 editorials in the local press suggesting setting up an investigation commission for the banking sector, 2012. In the years that followed, we had 3 commissions, and I served, reluctantly but diligently, as an advisor to one of them. I say reluctantly for reasons I can explain, and diligently in that I produced a 100-page report, complete with analysis of bank and debt data. Now, this report, Mr. Commissioner, regrettably you cannot find it on the webpage. It was classified as confidential by the Commission, headed by Judge Kitis, and was not used in the report. And Judge Nicolaou, who had adopted the report, was not allowed to include her dissenting opinion in the report. Now, I will explain why this is a problem. I'm not complaining, I wrote it, it's fine. So how should an investigation commission be set up? It should have on its panel well-recognized experts who understand the banking and financial system. For instance, the Icelandic Commission was chaired by a judge with members of the country's ombudsman and the finance professor of Icelandic origin from Yale University. A world-renowned expert on banking was recruited as an advisor, and his report is an integral part of the Commission's publicly available webpage. It provided significant input to the Commission's findings. Second, the Commission should have a broad mandate to examine the wide range of actions, omissions, or policies that led to the crisis. This could include, but are not restricted to, issues of corporate governance, mistakes or negligence by the central bank, and mistakes or negligence by the government. All of the things we have heard in the Commissioner's Commissioner's The Commission should also examine the role of broader policies about the banking and financial sector and the extent to which they create fragilities. Recognizing that corruption, malfeasance, and legal violations could play a significant role, the Commission should identify potential violations of the supervisory regulations, violations of the law, and violations of corporate governance statutes, and report such issues to the competent prosecutor. That you just heard an example. The Commission should make public its report and all related documents for a good reason, so that they can be scrutinized, so that society at large can draw its own conclusions and learn from it. In my classes, I'm using the reports from Iceland, Ireland, and the US, and please put your notes if I want to use the Australian next time. I'm using 2 of the 3 Cyprus reports, and oddly I'm not using the one for which I was an advisor. However, a commission is not a court. For a crisis to occur, many factors must coexist, and not all of them can be adjudicated. Now, the setup I just described satisfies Draghi's knowledge dimension. Courage. Courage requires that the Commission should be ready to dig deeply to uncover all those responsible and not stay at the obvious culprits. The obvious culprits are the President and the central banker on whose watch the crisis erupted, the banker whose bank failed, and the politician who interferes with the appointment of board members. The not so obvious, but equally responsible, are the flawed banking policies, the perfectly illegal but non-performing loans of politically exposed persons, the convenient but unsustainable size of government programs. And humility requires an understanding that the issues are many and complex, and a willingness to go beyond the comfort zone of the Commission members to seek expert advice. Now, how did Cyprus investigate its banking crisis? What did we learn, and were we successful? So in Cyprus, we set up 3 commissions. First, in 2012, the Lascelles Commission. This was appointed by the central banker who took office just as the crisis was erupting. It issued its report in October 2013. Not only this commission had a remarkable composition, according to the specifications, but also it had the right mandate, as the new central banker had all the noble intentions to uncover problems fermented under his predecessor, so he was free to do this. The committee's mandate was on banking and not on the economy in general. This conveniently left the government, who had just appointed the governor, outside the commission's investigation glass. Thankfully for us, however, it gave the commission a free hand to investigate the banking crisis. I consider their report a success, and this is a broad consensus. Second, in 2013, the British Commission, chaired by a respected retired Supreme Court judge who had served on the International Criminal Court. The mandate of this commission was broad. It was mandated to investigate 26 items in line with the mandates of other commissions, in line with the things we heard from the Australian Commission. The 27th item mandated the Commission to consider any law violations on the preceding 26 items. The Commission now, by a majority opinion 2-1, decided that since there was ongoing court proceedings against the failed Laik Bank, this bank should be excluded from the investigation. This decision put the banking sector at the periphery of the crisis and put the economy at the center. This was convenient for the appointing president, like the previous commission was convenient for the appointing governor, because it focused the investigation on the previous government party that was now in the opposition. I consider the report of this commission a failure. While they provide a nice narrative of the development of the crisis, it failed in two aspects. First, by ignoring Laik Bank, it failed to address the well-known bank sovereign doom loop, the adverse feedback effects between the banking and the public sector. This was a major aspect of the Cyprus crisis, and the Commission just ignored it. And second, it did not provide the rigorous theoretical or empirical justification of its findings, as the Irish, Icelandic, and US Commissions had done. By its composition, it could only deal competently, and by competently, I mean everybody's competent in their sphere of expertise. And in other spheres, they need expert advice. So this commission could only deal competently with judicial matters, but it decided to exclude them. Interestingly, the person who descended on the opinion to ignore Laiki and the opinion to ignore the advisory report was the ex-ombudsman. She had approached the problem with a broader perspective based on her experience as an ombudsman or ombudswoman, and not only from the narrow perspective of her training as a judge. Third commission, in 2019, the so-called Cooperative Commission to investigate the failure of the Cyprus Cooperative Bank. This one consisted of a judge, an economist, and a professional banker. They also recruited a university professor who provided expert opinion and analysis of data. The mandate of this commission was narrow and well specified, and its report is in general considered a success. Personally, I strongly agree that this was a successful investigation. Interestingly, the Commission apportioned great responsibility to the current Minister of Finance. And I believe this outcome speaks for the importance, the outcome of apportioning responsibility to the Minister of the government, of the President appointed, right? I think this speaks for the importance of the right composition and of the right mandate. Now, how well did we do? I'm going to show you the main findings of the Lessard and Cooperatives report. So first, the SARS report. No coherent national strategy and weak fiscal policy. Second, weak corporate governance in the banks. Third, poor risk management culture in the banks. Fourth, weak governance of the Cyprus Central Bank and ineffective supervision. Fifth, external events. And sixth, culture and attitudes. I'm not going to discuss what we did with this. Unfortunately, I don't have a nice story like the High Commissioner of things that were done and discussed during the debate, but this is the finding from the 2013 Commission. And here, Mr. Commissioner, is the findings for the 2019 report of the failure of the Cyprus Cooperative Bank. It's in Greek, and you do not think you understand. But what is written there, the 4 items written there, is the Greek translation of 4 of the 6 items that were on the previous slide. And I took these 2 slides, the originals from the 2 reports. So my punchline is 6 years after the crisis and after a beautiful report by Lascelles and his colleagues, identifying things that people in the field, scholars and practitioners know that's how crises happen. 6 years later, we have another commission asking why did this bank fail, and the answer is the same reasons why we had a crisis 6 years ago. So with this remark, thank you very much for inviting me, and I look forward to the questions and discussion.
Thank you, Professor Zenius. We're going to have a panel discussion at the moment. Back in 1997, a KLM flight was on a runway at Schiphol Airport waiting for takeoff. The visibility was low, the air traffic control system was not functioning well, and the junior engineer told the captain that there was another plane on the runway to take off. The captain refused to listen to the junior engineer, who was also his student, and as a result, he proceeded to take off but crashed on the plane in front of it. Thousands of casualties. The investigation revealed that the human factor contributed to the crash. I wonder, therefore, can we blame the human factor in the banking situation, irrespective of which country we are talking about? I was invited 2 weeks ago to attend the OECD Forum on Trust in Business, and one of the speakers mentioned that Apple has launched its own credit card, and they said it is the only credit card not issued by a bank, as the banks cannot be trusted. Can we trust the high-tech Silicon Valley company more than the banks? In fact, greed was omnipresent in banks, regardless whether it was in Cyprus or Australia. It's not only an issue of trust, but I ask, is that an issue of trustworthiness? So I asked Professor Zenius, do you think banks generally are trusted to be transparent, accountable, and are our banking executives trustworthy?
Well, this is not a kind of high period in a banker's career, this period of economic history. But I think, first of all, we have learned a lot from the crisis. We, in general, like the European Union, have learned a lot. And one of the things we have learned is people respond to incentives. So if you give bankers incentives to give lots of loans, they will give lots of loans, like they did in the US under Bill Clinton. And if the loans crash 10 years later, they say, but my job was to give loans. In Cyprus, we had this, one of the bankers that we were calling people to come and get a loan. Again, it was incentives. This is changing now with more strict standards that societies are adopting. Then we had the issue of more transparency, the independence of the board. One of the findings in both the Lascelles report and the cooperative is that the risk committee was not functional in either case. Well, the role of the board is not to manage the bank. The role of the board is not to make sure that the right people are appointed. The right people usually means people I know or people from my party. The role of the job of the board is to make sure the bank takes appropriate risks, setting the risk outright. They also want to make a point, which is kind of a point I'm going to repeat tonight, that we said to be demonized, the role of the political parties. Now, I consider it legitimate that the different ideologies in the country are interested in which way the banking sector is going. Is the banking sector promoting social cohesion, social inclusion? Is it sensitive to the poorer? It's a legitimate question. It's a question for the left to be concerned about. It's also legitimate for the political ideologies to worry about entrepreneurship, innovation, the free economic agents. It's very legitimate, and this is the job of the right. But once you are there to express these noble ideas, make sure you express these noble ideas. Your job is not there to appoint your friend from the right, my friend from the left. It's not the way to serve the noble ideas of the political party. So they are not to be trusted to the extent that we have not created the right incentives. But in the European Union, in the banking union, at that level, I think the debate is very healthy and very honest.
Honourable High Commissioner, it seems that in Australia, the crowd voice has been successful in getting the government to act upon the banking inquiry. What is it you think that makes Australian crowd voice so powerful?
Crowd voice.
Yeah.
Well, I think it was a combination of public pressure plus information being available. I think we had a situation where banks were being seen to not be operating as genuine members of society and not contributing to it. So that social compact that exists in Western liberal democracies between people, institutions and government are fundamentally broken down. It was quite a politicised debate for a long time. It became a very political issue because the government at the time took steps to try and address some of the failings in the banking sector, but public opinion wasn't won over. And then it simply got to a point where the legislation, when legislation on completely unrelated issues started to go badly as well, that the government ended up moving forward with the Royal Commission. So it's when that social compact breaks down that crowd voice is amplified.
I think it also requires a certain level of sophistication of the people who cut the political process. It's a very, I fully agree with the analysis. But then you need, as I said, like when we're building this excessive debt, there was no political debate. Someone should have gotten up and say, where are we going? I mean, it's great, people are getting loans, we're satisfying the Maastricht criteria, the government at the time that was centered at the left were happy. And the right, they took push back a little bit because it was convenient for them as well. And to be honest, many of us have missed it as well. But the reason we have missed it, I mean, you can blame us, that people only want us academics, and you're right. But I will explain why someone was missing. Because we felt it's not our job to do that. There was no Council of Economic Advisors that someone says, have a look at this. right? There was no think tank where you could go and express your opinion. So we said, okay, this is not our problem. Society wants us to teach their children. We teach them, they want us to do research in the topics. And it's only when things started blowing up that several of my colleagues at the University of Cyprus and some others started looking at the data. And they said, oh my God, what is going on here? And started expressing kind of cow voice, as you say, isolated, it's more institutional.
Yeah. Professor Zenius, do you think it is the rotten apples or the rotten culture with the wrong incentives that are to be blamed for the banking situation? And how many banks do you think it will take to close down in Cyprus before we learn from that mistake?
Okay, let me make it clear. With the report, it's the culture. There is a culture. This, we will have one bank that was subject to what is known in the literature as bank looting, right? How do you loot a bank? You don't have to rob a bank. You loot it. How do you loot it? You buy it. If the money is healthy, after you buy it, you give loans to yourself. But you don't have to buy all of it. I'll give you instructions how to do that. If you buy about 13% shares of the bank, basically you have control and power. You can appoint the CEO, you can appoint the loan officers, and then you go to them and you give the 13% shares as collateral, and you get loans of much higher value. When the bank collapses, what do? You say to the manager, sorry, you messed up. Now you can keep my shares collateral, but actually I'm going to complain that the bank was collapsed. But the reason the bank was collapsed is because I was not paying my loans that they called us with collateral with construction. So we had one case that was looted systematically. We failed to find legal violations because all of this was done very carefully to be within the law, or someone else had worked in the gray area. That's why I have sympathy with the Attorney General is getting a lot of criticism that the economy collapsed, and how many people were sent to jail. We heard the commissioner, the long list of people that were reported. In Cyprus cannot be so successful because the supervisors failed to do their jobs, the board of directors failed to do their jobs, and therefore whoever was under the radar was finding a gray zone. It's very difficult to find cases. So you need the culture to be very correct. It's not a couple of crooks. If we think it's a couple of crooks that blew up our economy, there will be for no surprise. We have to realize that it's up to us. Asking our bankers to be accountable, asking our political party to make sure they have the right people at the right positions. And the right people does not side with my cousin.
Final question from me. Where do you think we will be in 12 months from now on the issue of banking commissions? Are there going to be any more banking commissions? Are there going to be any more banking closing down?
It's kind of embarrassing after the talk by the commissioner. The first report, the last report, three of the members were world-renowned experts in banking in the countries, and the fourth one was a civil economist and a former banker. And because the way explained the report was geared towards banking, and the only other was kind of blame was the previous government or its steps, everybody said, yes, it's a very good report. I learned yesterday that there was a decision by the Council of Ministers that this is a good report and we are going to adopt it and implement these recommendations. But actually, this decision was written by one of the members. The president asked them, what should we do now? Please draft me what you should do. And whatever they told him to do, it passed by the Council of Ministers. And nothing has happened. When I was on the board of the central bank, I was on the other side of the table where the commission was presenting their work, and we liked it. And I made the recommendation to the government that he should talk to the Minister of Finance and have a joint commission to see this implemented. And I heard yesterday that this was not the commission approval to and they agreed, and nothing happened. So are we going to have more commissions? I think now that supervision is also coming to a large extent from Europe, single supervisor mechanism. Things are much safer. As I said, the non-performing loans is a big problem. The economy has been improving, is more healthy, but we're very fragile. An external shock can create lots of trouble without precluding another crisis. So we will have to be aware, and I hope. I was impressed when we get the commitment and the package of legislation, right? Sometimes when I say these things, they say, no, this is academic. I said, look, there is nothing to do. Tell me I'm wrong. But if I'm right, it's not academic, it's your job to do it. Your government did it. I don't know who is the gentleman who wrote the report, but it sounded like a very solid piece of work. I'm sure he had a staff supporting him in many aspects, right? I'm sure whatever he found out, if I look carefully, I can point out, here's how the theory goes, this is how you should do. And the remarkable thing is he put it in a policy framework and someone actually did it. In our case, the only legislation we did was whatever the Troika had pushed us. And again, the Lessan's report said that cooperatives should consolidate from 200 banks to 1. We pushed to go from 200 to 18 because my village could not agree with your village, so we pushed to 18. And today we have none because we failed to implement the project.
What do you think will happen in Australia apart from the legislations? I hear there's more.
Yeah, no, that's right. From the government's perspective, over 54 recommendations that were directed to it. There's a clear commitment to deal with them in the current, the course of the current government. So we have elections every 3 years. So there's a clear indication of the driver. They'll be punished politically if action isn't taken. So, and I should say we're reasonably early in the process, and so there will be reviews along the way to look at implementation, because the proof of the process will be in the implementation. The Commissioner Hayne did have a team around him. Millions of dollars was spent on the process, but a Royal Commission report is only as good as the response to it. So far what the signals are now, and now it's just up to the population to hold the government to account and to actually do what they say.
Okay, so any questions from you? We have some microphones around, so we have a few people working in banks, so it'd be interesting to hear your comments, your questions. Or we're working in banks. Yeah?
Disasters, because as you said, the problem is the design, and I'm not staying to what we discussed today. Today we are going for a cashless society, and we say that it is because we need to know where the money is coming from, etc., etc. But it can be also for control. And then we have new things. We are an education institution here. Let's say in England and in the United States, we see crying students with all the loans that they are getting. So it means that they have found new ways to continue a disaster. And there is the whole system is not working. And it will never work. It will never work. It has not worked. It's just the whole design. It needs a total change of what we expect from a system, not just from the banks. The banks are obsolete at the moment, all over the world. And what is coming from abroad is not safer. It's just Mrs. Lagarde, whatever her name is, Lagarde, whatever she is, she said, okay, let us throw money in advertising for a cashless society in a way. What for? This is cutting human rights, and the bank should be a human rights story.
I sound like firebrand sometimes, but I'm not a revolutionary. So, but one comment that's very valid, and there is concern, is that the student loan that were pumping money to something that sounds novel, like housing was a novel thing, everybody had a house. But if you cannot afford it or you cannot pay for it, at some point it's crashed. So everybody gets a university degree, of course it's a very noble aim. But if not everybody can do it, or not everybody can get a job after they do it, why shouldn't they? So there is a big concern that the student loan, especially in the US, is the next big bubble that will break.
Well, I'd like to pose one more question. Yeah?
I would like to ask for these results in our society, poor corporate governance, absence of risk-based approach, ineffective central bank guidance. Which is the main cause? Which is the main cause? Corruption? Or it's our culture? What do we have to do? We have to act within our society or somewhere else. Thank you.
This is a very good question. Like the gentleman is asking to identify a few reasons for the collapse. And he's asking a deeper question. What is one reason we have all these reasons, right? But I'll go back to my earlier comment. I mean, these issues are mostly addressed by the political system. It's the political system who appoints a governor of the central bank and the board of the central bank from which everything else follows. Unavoidably, the political system has interest in the big banks of the country. And they should have to make sure that, as I said before, that credit is going socially acceptable, but also encouraging entrepreneurship. But this political process should be exercised with the goal of achieving the long-term objectives of the banking system in this specific case from a broad ideological perspective, not from the narrow perspective of every party must have 3 positions on every board. I find it, I mean, some of my colleagues disagree with me. They call them purists. They say, why did the president, who is now from the right, ask the left to appoint a person on the central bank board? I have no problem with this. I want the central bank board appointed mainly by the president of the time to have the trust of the left. But make sure that whoever they send you is of the right caliber to serve on the board. Which also implies that whomever you appoint there is of the right caliber to serve on the board. And also, it's up to each one of us. Every time we're asking a favor, we're punching the economy. If my cousin deserves a job at the bank, I'm sure a fair professional capitalist is going to hire my cousin. And if my cousin does not deserve a job, he should not get it. And therefore, there is no reason for me to call Professor Kapardis, especially when she invited me. She said, yes, but I'm doing my cousin application was happening, right? Every time we do such things, we're causing trouble process. So, and hold our politicians to much higher standards.
Okay, well, I'd like to close off the panel with a Keynesian paradox on how incremental improvements can impede innovation. Just like the electric light did not come from continuous improvement of candles, but small incremental improvements are sometimes not enough and often slow down innovation. Instead, what may be needed is a major step forward or a radical change. I'd like to thank our distinguished guests. As a token, I'd like to give them a small gift from the university. I'd also like to thank you all and our students who volunteered to help the organization, the supporters of the event, and the Department of Health Tourism for organizing. Your certificates will be outside and they will